I'm excited to do a little bit of that to transition into the book. I've got a few terms here that maybe we could
Okay.
talk about to get us started. One is probably a really easy one for you is who is Aristotle? For anyone that is, obviously people have probably heard the name, but
Uh-huh.
if you could paint the picture of maybe the where, when, and
Okay.
why he's a perennial figure.
Yeah. So Aristotle was a Greek philosopher in ancient Greece. So active in the 4th century BCE. So he was a student of Plato. So if you think of like the most famous Greek philosophers, I think if there's Socrates, whose pupil was Plato, and then there's Aristotle, who is pupil of Plato. So Aristotle comes to Athens. Your audience may have heard of Alexander the Great. There have been some recent movies for the history buffs about him. So Aristotle grew up in the kingdom of Macedon, so contemporary Macedonia. And his father was court physician to the court of Philip, King Philip, father of Alexander the Great. So he was, part of the sort of the high society in Macedonia. But he came to Athens as a 17-year-old, so he sent from Macedonia to Athens, where Athens was where Plato's academy was. And so he enrolled in Plato's academy the way we send our children when they're 17 and 18-year-olds who enroll in the university of whatever. But Aristotle stayed there for not the rest of his life, for at least another 20 years or so. So there were no diplomas. You didn't have to leave. It was a research center. So he was a member of Plato's academy. He became a philosopher in his own right. And then after Plato died, Aristotle left Athens for a while, but he came back and then he founded his own school, the Lyceum. So all of our own vocabulary, like we talk about the academy, like this is higher education. That's Plato's academy was the name of the original institution of higher education in this tradition. And a lyceum, often in French you talk about lycée, so it's like a college or high school. That comes from the Lyceum. So Aristotle founded his school, the Lyceum. And he stayed in Athens until just before he died, which was the year just after his pupil, because Aristotle had actually been a tutor to Alexander at some point in his career. Alexander the Great, who had conquered most of the Greek world. There was a lot of anti-Macedonian sentiment in Athens just after Alexander died. And Aristotle was a resident alien, like his status was a meta. He wasn't Athenian. He was politically vulnerable. He left and he lived on an island. And he died there within the year. I think he died at the age of 62 around BC.
And another term that comes up early on in the book is this Greek term eudaimonia.
Uh-huh.
How should we think about that today?
Well, I guess eudaimonia is the central term in the ethical tradition that comes out of ancient Greek. And I think the way to translate it is happiness. Right. But when we translate eudaimonia as happiness, we have to be kind of very broad-minded and think, what do we think of as happiness? There's a very terminology and words change their meanings over centuries, even within the same language. I'm very much a language nerd. So thinking about how we get a lot of our terms from Greek and Latin, and then even how Greek terms get their etymology, kind of think about. But if you think about how even the English term happiness, if you look it up in a big historical dictionary, like the Oxford English Dictionary, which will tell you, go back centuries and how a term was used, you find that happiness was used to talk about someone, if you're happy, not you're feeling good, but rather you're doing well. And so in a good example of this, a related term in Greek that Aristotle uses interchangeably with eudaimonia, or at least with the adjective, is makarios. So, and that's how, if you might describe, if you're a pagan Greek of Aristotle's era, and you want to talk about the gods, you could say they are makarioi. So that's to say they are blessed, right? So we use the term kind of blessed. It has a really theological context, but if you think of in the New Testament, if you think of the Beatitudes, right, in the Gospel, so blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. That's translated from Greek, and the Greek, which is several centuries later than Aristotle, is blessed translates makarios, and makarios means the same thing as eudaimonia in lots of contexts. So what you have is, when you say blessed are the meek, you're not saying they feel really good, right? You're saying that they are, benefits come to them. It's not just that they get this reward, but this is saying this is, the best kind of life. This is an amazingly good life. Inheriting the earth, then you have to, that's how, a life in which you are meek and then the world is yours, and you have to figure out what that means. But that's an endorsement of what counts in life. So eudaimonia is the central term in Greek ethics, and Aristotle actually was probably the philosopher who made that the central question. The people who get to define the questions for other people to answer, they're influential, even if their answers are not the ones that we would accept. So as Aristotle's the one who said, the question is, what is his whole ethical treatise, in fact, the one that I've excerpted in this book, How to Flourish, is all trying to answer the question, what is happiness? And he's really asking, how should we live? And so how can we be eudaimons? If you want to live a blessed life in a certain idiom, or if you want to live a happy life, and you think if you're a parent, what do you wish for your children to have? Happiness, a good life. That's what eudaimonia involves. So it's hard to translate, but we have to translate it.
Yeah. And something that comes up in the book is this idea that happiness is for its own sake, kind of not some other end like other things. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. So if you read Plato, you get the sense from the figure of Socrates, as usually the speaker thinks that happiness is the most important question in his life is, how can we be happy? What is it to be happy? Whereas Aristotle wants us to ask, what is, think about what is happiness. I'm sorry, I've just lost track of exactly how you phrased the question. Can you?
I was hoping you could talk a little bit about this idea of happiness being for its own sake, different than some of these other things where it's not for some other end.
Right. So I guess where I was heading by that circuitous route is that Aristotle puts this kind of structure on what I'm not going to tell you exactly all the details of how to live a happy life, whether you should be a dentist or whether you should be a plumber or what you should do, none of that. But we can just think about happiness it's something, it's good. And what is it to be good? Well, to be good is to be something that's worth desiring. It's to aim for. And there are different kinds of goods. You can just say things that we value are valuable. They're valuable for their own sake. And they can also be valuable for the sake of other things. There are some things that are valuable only for the sake of other things, like having a root canal. That's valuable for the sake of dental health and avoiding pain, but it's not valuable for its own sake. So if you think of what is happiness in the most abstract terms possible, where there's going to be lots of variety, how you fill it in, and given your life circumstances, your historical circumstances, that it's sort of the ultimate goal in life. So you think of happiness as something that's valuable for its own sake, right? Not because it gets you something else, but rather it's your way of thinking of it's what's ultimately worthwhile, where that formulation plays the same role as for its own sake. So if you're inquiring to what is happiness, and I think, how should I live my life? That's sort of maybe that Socratic way of forming the question. Where you get to Aristotle says, what is ultimately worthwhile in life? Or how do you live your life? How do you conceive of a life that's governed by a commitment to what's ultimately worthwhile? And as you can see, this is how you can think of it in terms of, integrity and thinking about meaning, and having sort of a point to life. If you think, what's the point to this? What's the point to this? You're asking, what is the thing that's worthwhile that you're going to get from it? Sometimes the thing you get from it that's worthwhile is the activity itself, right? That's a friendship is worthwhile for this, right? In a lot of people's lives, religion and its activity is worthwhile for this. And so that's Aristotle's way of, I think, helping us understand in a more kind of formal level what happiness is. Okay, we can disagree about what life is a happy life. There are lots of disagreements about that. What's the best life? But we have to have some agreement about what we're disagreeing about. When we're talking about happiness, we're talking about, what is ultimately worthwhile in life? What is the source of value in a life? But still, it doesn't mean we're going to come up with a single answer that's got a single blueprint and we're going to go to war to make sure that everyone follows this. None of all that. He's just trying to think, well, happiness is, if you think about it in this very American formula, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, where this is kind of ideal, different. You should be free to pursue your own, what you think is worthwhile in your life. And there are things that no one should be able to infringe upon your ability to do so within certain limits. So that's about happiness. And it's not life, liberty, and the pursuit of pleasure and the pursuit of satisfaction. No, it's about having a conception of a life and what makes it worth living and being able to pursue that. That's sort of something very human and sort of ultimately, not just ultimately, but sort of fundamentally worthwhile. That's where when you talk about what's good or valuable for its own sake, I think that's how it fits into an Aristotelian framework.
It's so interesting, like the level of maybe clarity or kind of this highest good, knowing what the highest good is. You mentioned pleasure, and you think about the Epicureans, another school of philosophy around that time. You have the Stoics around this time as well. Virtue is the only good. So this kind of need to come up with some sort of response to, what is this highest good? How do you think about that today in the way of clarity, having some clarity in our own lives?
Yeah, so I think that I'm sort of partial to, of course, a very Aristotelian view. So you think about, I think the highest good, if I want to have a view about what the highest good that's true to myself, but also respectful of differences with other people who might be living lives that I would never want for myself, like I couldn't, right? But nonetheless, you can respect that they would choose them. Then I'm going to think, well, how do you conceive of what the highest good is? And I think it's using all of your all the features that you have as a human being, right? And then that includes sort of being reflective and thinking, feeling the pull of the search for wisdom. So because Aristotle says, well, when we're talking about happiness, this is the best life for a human being, not the best life for an animal, that is, for a non-human animal. He thinks that human beings, in his view, this is his philosophical anthropology, and he shares this with Plato as well, is that we're sort of like a hybrid between animals and gods. And Aristotle has, and again, this is in common with Plato, this very intellectual conception of God or gods. He's very indifferently polytheist or monotheist in the language. But God is sort of pure intellect, whereas animals have desires and actions and they take care of themselves. They can be magnificent in all kinds of ways, but we are human animals, which means we have everything that animals have. And we have a little bit of what the gods have, which is the ability not just to figure out how best to satisfy our needs and desires as animals, but to even develop and manage our abilities we have as animals and all those desires and feelings, and that's part of our animal nature. But we can have, when you cultivate your character, so you can be courageous, or so you can be caring or generous or self-disciplined, what you're doing is you're trying to harness your animal nature in line with the way you're using this divine part of your nature, which is your reason or your powers of reflection. And I think that's why when Aristotle famously says that he actually gives you a definition of what happiness is, but that's not something you could then say it's 12 steps you can now apply. First you make your bed and then you do nothing like that. He says happiness is the activity of virtue, right? Where virtue, he thinks, is what you've done when you've taken your rational powers, your powers you have because this is the divine element of you, and you've used it to inform your life, right? So it's living in the line. The way I think was living your life in a way that you can endorse. You're honest with yourself. I mean, you have to be aware and you have to pay attention. You have to know things about yourself and your situation, about other people. But you don't defer your judgment always to what the crowd says or what your belly says, or or what's on Netflix or whatever. Right? It's a kind of a self-directed life that's living in a way that only a human being can live, even though different human beings will lead very different lives. But if you're just like the couch potato, right, and you never develop your talents and you're quite passive in the way you respond to questions of urgency, either about yourself or about other people, then you're not fully developing your powers, and so you're not living the best human life.